The last book of mine, which has been published 3 months ago, happens to be a collection of my own poems in English translation. It is titled Misplaced Objects and Other Poems. This is the book published by the Sahitya Academy, and this happens to be part of a series that the Sahitya Academy has been publishing over the years of the translations of award-winning books into English and into all other major Indian languages. Of course, this will be followed by books in something like 17 or 18 other languages into which this will get translated over the maybe coming 2 or 3 years. This is not exactly a translation of the award-winning book alone. It carries 85 poems that I have written over the years. In fact, the first poem was written in 1973 and the last poem in 2013. So it covers perhaps the whole of my creative period for a long time, and it represents the range and variety of my writing. It is thematically various because it has poems on my grandmother, poems on my family. There are poems on love, poems on books, poems on social themes, and even poems of protest. So they, in some sense, I would say that this is perhaps the most representative book so far of my poems that have come out in English. And this follows while I write another collection that HarperCollins had published 3 years ago. There are some of the poems in that collection also here, because this happens to be a kind of selection from my earlier collections plus new poems. Altogether there are 85 poems, and I believe that this book is apt to give the reader an idea of my poetic imagination, the way it works, my different styles of poetry, and my worldview in general. I read a short poem which from my earlier times. This was written in 1973. It's called Granny. My granny was insane. As her madness ripened into death, my uncle, a miser, kept her in our storeroom wrapped in straw. My granny dried up, burst, her seeds flew out of the window. The sun came and the rain. One seedling grew up into a tree whose desire bore me. Can I help writing poems about monkeys with the teeth of gold? Now I will read a poem which is more recent, written in 2013. Well, this is a poem based on an incident that happened in Turkey, in Istanbul, during the pro-democracy protests. There were many places where demonstrations were banned. In one such place, in Taksim Square in Istanbul, a couple came and started kissing. And hearing about this from the Facebook and other social media, thousands of couples came and began kissing each other, and that became a new form of protest for democracy and openness. The poem is based on that incident, called The Kiss. You didn't believe when the poet said, the world changes when two people kiss. See them, a man, a woman. They kiss, not a man and a woman, but many men, many women, in the same square where the enforcers of law and of morals used to frown together if ever they walked hand in hand. A man, a woman, many men, many women, in the square, once a prison to every kiss. They are breaking the law, the present law of death. They are making the law, the future's law of life. Poetry is a private kiss, provocatively exchanged in a public place. Yeah, in fact, even though I see my poetry as a continuum, critics have seen 2 or 3 phases in my poetry. There was this early period late 60s and early 70s, when I was part of the modernist movement in Malayalam, where we had other poets like Ayyappa Panikkar, N.N. Kakkad and quite a few others, because we were trying new forms. We were coming out of the old metrical forms, writing in free verse and writing in prose, and using new kinds of metaphors and images. And in the latter half of the 70s, my poetry becomes a little more political and socially concerned, because there is a period when across India things were happening. Many social sections were emerging into light and expression. Women were getting organized for their emancipation. That was happening with Dalits, and it was happening with a lot of subaltern sections of the society. And my poetry also moved with them and began to express the agony and the indignation of these sections of the people who had so far been so much marginalized. But in the 80s, I turned more towards Kerala, Malayalam, the regional language and the regional culture. My poetry became a little more specific regarding Kerala's landscape, our celebrations and rituals, and the public life of Kerala in general. So these are three recognized faces in my poetry, even though maybe today, well, this is what I write is a kind of product of all these phases, because I keep alternating between, say, a poem of indignation and protest and a poem about nature, or a poem about something which is very close to Kerala's own intimate culture. If there is a dominant theme at all, I would call it our time. By which I mean the time when the media have taken over in a big way. The social media are changing the texture of our everyday life, and even of love, which is becoming more and more ephemeral, I think, because we no more have the kind of that long-lasting, almost blind romantic love that we used to celebrate in our early poetry. Even love has become something transient and more temporary, and they also speak about the other changes in the society, because the intrusion of the market values and how our own cherished traditional values are perhaps coming to an end, or there's a crisis to that. There is also a crisis to cultural freedom, especially freedom of expression, as it is very evident from some of the recent happenings in the country. I also join the various voices which are trying to go against this suppression of freedom. Well, all these together I call our times, and all the changes which are reflected in different arts, in theatre, in film, in visual arts. Everywhere you find a reflection of these changing times. So I am trying to capture the nuances of this transformation that is happening very fast. Maybe it has been happening for over a decade, and it is still happening. So it is very difficult actually to capture that transformation in the same kind of speed and with the same kind of force. But I am trying to bring my poetry to this scene of what is happening today, and making it face this reality and try to create a new poetry out of today's happenings. Yeah, indeed. In fact, my early poetry was essentially, a kind of dark and morbid, one can say, full of anguish, full of disillusionment, which was in fact shared by a lot of young people of that time. And only that later this anguish became a little more open and social, because I began to worry over what is happening around me. Until then it was a kind of very personal and private kind of feeling, which is now more of a kind of public feeling. There is a concern and an anguish which is shared by a lot of people of our time, an anguish about what is happening to society, what is happening to the country, the terrorism, the communalism, the various kinds of terrible things that are happening around. So I am still anguished, but the anguish, as I said, is perhaps has moved from the private to the public realm more. Oh yeah, indeed. I have quite a few poems about language itself, because I believe that it's often difficult to articulate the complexity of our times in the language that has been given to us by tradition. Often we need to innovate, we need to create new forms, we need to break and reconnect language. We need sometimes to challenge metrical forms and other kinds of closed forms of poetry and create more open forms in order to come to terms with the reality that we are living every day with. And so this itself becomes the theme of many of my poems. There's a poem called Stammer, where language is a major theme. There is even a poem called I Am a Language, which is about a painter, trying to express René Magritte, to whose museum I had recently gone. The idea of language and the idea of expression itself becomes one of the central concerns of my poetry, and I have quite a few poems on poetry, on poetic language, on the difficulties of using an old language to express a new reality.